Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chief. Appreciate the testimony. I have exactly the opposite problem of Mr. Kilburn. I have more people than trees, and probably more cows than people. So it's a very different kind of landscape. In fact, we see 5 trees together. We define that as a forest in Oklahoma. But we have very little federal land. You know, we've got Indian trust land, and it's frankly well managed by the tribes that hold it. We've got some military reservations that are obviously federal and well managed, but we don't, and a couple of wildlife preserves and 1 national park. So, but most of our land is in private hands. And I'm just curious, as I hear these problems like Mr. Stewart addressed, and I hear my colleagues from states that, you know, 85% of the land is federally owned. Do you have you manage over 190 million acres, and I think you do it very well with the resources that you have. But what is the merit of considering, should we be offloading some of this land? Do you see it in perpetuity staying as it is? I'm interested in your long-term view of what we do with the asset. Do we hold it as federal government, or is there merit, as some of my colleagues say, in returning this one way or another in a managed way into private ownership?
Well, I'll start with a quote from Gifford Pinchot, the first chief of this agency when this agency was created. And the quote is simply that national forests, they exist for one reason, and one reason only: the public wants them. The national forests were reserved from the public domain, majority of them, when Congress was petitioned, or the administration at that time, the president was petitioned to be able to withdraw these areas from the public domain because they were not okay with the amount of devastation, flooding that was occurring, etc. This lack of any management, this was back in the 1800s. And so that's what created the system of lands. And then there's a system of laws that Congress has passed, presidents have signed, and agencies have implemented on the ground to represent how the public wants these lands managed. Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act. Wonderful to read it, sounds perfect, but I'll tell you, it is really difficult to implement it on the ground. And it's one of the things that's different than how the states manage a lot of their lands, and of course private landowners, is that we have to find that balance of all these different uses versus being able to manage it for any single one use. So for me, I like the way that we have our system of ownership in this country. I think it provides all the benefits to the public.
Let me posture again, and it's not meant to be adversarial in any way. It's something I struggle with. We actually do have a lot of timberland in southeast Oklahoma. Most of that is privately held. And it was set up that way when the state was opened up. Frankly, a lot of the Indian tribes were sort of looted out of the land. We just had a big settlement on that, which we appreciate. But the land remains in private hands, and it's productive, a beautiful area. So what I'm wondering is, we clearly have systems that have come into being at different times, and it's one thing for me to think about what I want to do in my state. It's quite another to imagine what I just love having 80% of Nevada in federal hands. Well, I'm not sure people in Nevada want to do that. And I'm not suggesting the elimination of these, but is there time or way to rethink whether or not we have the right portions? Because those questions, as Mr. Stewart suggested, are coming up, and they're coming up in a not very productive way, in my view. We have a lot of people caught in difficult circumstances, and they feel adversarial with their own government when they don't want to feel that way. So, how would we rethink some of these things, or should we, again? Because while it's true, we've created this system, it's an accident in the way we created it. We didn't think about it that way from the beginning of the Republic. We didn't apply that set of standards to every state in the country, let alone every region in the country. Given that, is there some merit to think in some ways of divesting it, or would you argue we should essentially take the assets we have, continue to manage them, get better at it, provide the resources? I'm just wondering if there's ever any thought inside the federal government about the first principle, if you will. How much of this land should we own? How much should be in private hands and managed differently?
Well, I'm a strong advocate for our system of land ownership, and I think these lands should remain in public ownership. They're public lands. I'm concerned that when I hear proposals from states, I'm concerned, how would you pay for the management? What would prevent you from selling it off? And then the public
Selling it off is
loses.
precisely what I'm suggesting, not all of it.
Yeah.
But I'm suggesting, well, I just think it's worth thinking about. And I'm just curious if the administration or anybody ever at least explores this as a realistic option. If it's no, it's like it is now, and we're going to think about managing things better and putting resources. That's one thing. If it's, do we ever go back and think, geez, how much do we need to hold? Where do we need to hold it? Or is it just we're going to hold what we have in perpetuity?
Well, that's my position, and based on what I hear from the publics across the country, and I understand that there's pockets, and I want to focus on what we can do to address those issues so that we can do a better job, to address those concerns. But we're very fortunate in this country to have this legacy, this conservation legacy, and I'll tell you in the future, when you think about that, close to 14% of the CO2 that's emitted every year in this country is sequestered in our forests. We need to be looking at how we can expand those forests. So the idea that we'd want to do anything to lose some of these lands to some form of development, we got to understand those consequences. Because as I look forward into the future, I'll tell you, it's going to be so important for us to be able to maintain and actually expand our forests, if for no other reason, just for air quality. They do an incredible job to sequester carbon, and then when we can have sustainable harvest, we also sequester it into these wood products. And so it's going to be something that's going to become even more important for this country and actually for the world.
Let me make this last point. You've been very generous, Mr. Chairman. Again, and my intent, I want you to be, is not to question you or to express sympathy with some of the types of actions that we've had and that you have to deal with. I don't think that's ever an acceptable thing. But I do think at some point, I mean, you've very articulately outlined your position, but I would like, some study as to, because again, we don't hold the same balance of lands regionally across this country. And I'm not in an area that's directly affected by this for the most part. But I do think when we own 1 out of 5 acres in the country is federally owned, that to me is worth thinking about, particularly when it's concentrated in a relatively small number of states, and enormously, 50, 60, 70% of a state being owned by the federal government is pretty difficult on the people that live there. And whether or not we should redistribute that is be a fair question too. But again, you've been very generous, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, and thank you, Chief.
Thank you.